I can't hang out any longer, man. We need to get some shelter.
Did see a cabin when I was doing my scout earlier. It's just a little ways that way.
Portlock wasn't just abandoned, it was expelled. A place so rich in promise, so laden with fish, timber, and game, that settlers kept returning time and again, only to vanish into whispers and shadows. Locals still speak its name in hushed tones, passing down warnings around flickering campfires. Crushed skulls, missing hunters, sleds flung across the forest floor, and trees rammed upside down into the earth. These aren't exaggerations, but recorded occurrences, anomalies that defy rational explanation. For centuries, Portlock has been the site of an unrelenting mystery, a nexus where history, science, and legend collide. Was it Bigfoot, as some claim, a creature of unimaginable strength and cunning? Or was it something more abstract, a perfect storm of fear, isolation, and forces we cannot name? Perhaps it was all of these things at once, layered like the fog that clings to the rocky Alaskan coastline, obscuring the treacherous cliffs and dark, whispering timber. Tonight, we go beyond the flickering shadows of campfire tales and into the meticulously kept records of those who dared to settle here. Spanish sailors who fled, British charts warning away from the shores, Alutiiq elders who imposed curfews, and the final overnight exodus in 1950, all these pieces together form a puzzle whose edges refuse to meet. From the very first landing, Portlock seemed to resist human habitation. Optimism would always come first, the promise of fertile land, endless fish, and secure forests. But dread, a creeping, nameless dread, would follow. It didn't roar like a storm, it didn't strike like a bear, it hummed. A quiet, omnipresent hum that made even the strongest men stumble, falter, and ultimately leave. This is a story that spans centuries, blending the historical with the paranormal, where every departure, every retreat seems to whisper the same warning. Some places are not meant to be settled. The first outsiders to reach Portlock were the Spanish in the late 1700s, lured by tales of abundant fish, thick forests, and land that promised a new beginning. What they found instead were haunting cries drifting through the dark timber, sickly winds that seemed to carry whispers, and a deep, inexplicable unease. The men fell ill despite perfect health, overcome with dizziness, weakness, and an overwhelming sense that they did not belong. Ships were abandoned, supplies left rotting, and records show that the men fled in terror, convinced that the land itself was cursed. 6 years later, the British arrived, led by Captain Nathaniel Portlock, a seasoned navigator famed for his practical mind and courage. Portlock was no man to be swayed by superstition, yet upon reaching the abandoned native village that had once thrived on this coastline, he found the same uncanny signs: empty dwellings still standing, smokeless hearths, and the remnants of lives that had ended abruptly. At first, the British crew attempted to settle, confident in their experience. But soon the same sickness struck. Men became lethargic, refused to work, and whispers of bad omens rippled through the camp. Fear mounted until, once again, humans could not claim victory over this place. Captain Portlock relented to the panic of his men, and they sailed away, leaving the land untouched. The pattern repeated. From that point on, the name Portlock became synonymous not with exploration or settlement, but with caution and dread. The logs of early expeditions all tell the same story: hope and optimism, followed by sickness, creeping dread, and ultimately retreat. The land offered timber, fish, and shelter from the violent storms of the open sea. Yet an invisible hand seemed to repel all who tried to call it home. Even more chilling were the abandoned native villages, whose emptiness hinted at a knowledge long ignored by outsiders. If the original inhabitants, the people who knew the land better than anyone, left suddenly without destruction, what warning did that carry? To put oneself in the position of those early settlers is to understand the profound weight of fear. They had crossed vast oceans, braved storms, and yet found themselves denied not by enemy fire, but by something intangible and unnamed. No engagement, no disaster, no famine, only whispers, sickness, and an oppressive weight pressing down on the soul until it begged to leave. Portlock became the crucible of the curse story, its reputation cemented by lived experience rather than folklore, whispered from journals to taverns, from sailors to settlers. The terror in Portlock was not always a roar or a sudden attack. It was subtle, pervasive, and insidious. It worked through the mind as much as the body. Healthy men faltered, their confidence replaced by an almost physical sensation of dread. What made these events particularly confounding for later historians and skeptics alike was the repetition. Two different crews from Europe, years apart, experienced the same phenomena: illness, paranoia, disorientation, and the gnawing sensation of being watched. Some have suggested that isolation and geography amplified normal fears, creating an almost psychological epidemic. Others have speculated that the air, the geology, or other natural elements of the area could distort perception. Yet even the most reasonable theories struggle to account for the more violent occurrences. Crushed bodies, overturned sleds, and the signs of physical struggle left behind in the forests. The early accounts from journals and maps indicate a terrifying consistency. The Spanish, the British, and later settlers all began with hope, moved to dread, and concluded with flight. This pattern underscores an essential truth about Portlock. The place itself seemed alive in its resistance. The forest, the cliffs, the fog, and the echoing valleys were more than scenery. They were active participants in a form of predation or psychological assault. To understand the settlers' fear is to grasp the profound isolation they endured, a wilderness in which every whisper of wind, every shadow, every unexplainable sound could become a harbinger of death, one of the most chilling. Scientific theories behind Portlock's mystery involves infrasound, sound waves vibrating below the threshold of human hearing. Though imperceptible to the ear, these waves can affect the body, causing nausea, headaches, disorientation, and even panic attacks. In nature, some predators exploit infrasound. Tigers, for example, can stun prey with low-frequency vibrations before striking. Elephants and whales communicate over vast distances using the same principle. Could it be that the Spanish and British settlers were not merely victims of disease or misfortune, but of the very landscape itself? Portlock sits on a jagged Alaskan coastline, surrounded by steep cliffs, dense forests, and echoing valleys. Fog and wind provide ideal conditions for low-frequency vibrations to resonate and amplify. Settlers may have staggered under invisible waves of pressure, their minds and bodies racked by sensations they could neither see nor explain. Haunting cries distorted by the geography would have seemed almost supernatural to men of the 18th century. Yet the infrasound theory, while compelling, cannot explain everything. Bodies crushed, sleds flung, dogs torn apart, these require mass and intent. Infrasound could scatter humans, induce fear, or make them vulnerable, but physical devastation points to something more, something capable of exerting raw force. This intersection of science and folklore allows believers and skeptics alike to interpret events differently. Skeptics see natural causes, while believers see a predator unseen that weaponized fear itself. Imagine standing in a mist-shrouded settlement, trees thrumming with invisible vibrations. Your head aches, your stomach turns, shadows stretch and twist, every sound amplified into menace. Would you stay to see what comes next or flee like every crew that arrived before you? In Portlock, even the strongest resolve can be fractured long before the predator shows itself. For the Sugpiaq people, also known as the Alutiiq, Portlock was no stranger to caution. By the 1800s, they had settled near these coasts, aware of its unnerving reputation. Their oral histories speak of the Nantinak, a creature described as half-man, half-beast, stalking forests and shores, preying on humans when hunting yielded little. The Nantianak are depicted as giants, hairy and powerful, capable of snapping trees and carrying humans with ease. Some accounts describe them as cannibals, striking at villages under cover of night. Unlike European myths, these warnings were part of lived experience. Raids, disappearances, and signs of struggle in the forests confirmed the tales. Settlers who ignored such warnings often paid a terrible price, a convergence of superstition, predator, and the unpredictable forces of a harsh Alaskan wilderness. The legends also serve as a psychological lens through which the Sugpiaq interpreted their environment. In a place where isolation, extreme weather, and the dense forest amplified every sound and shadow, the line between predator and myth blurred. The Nantinak were as real as hunger, cold, and death. Stories of cannibal giants, violent raids, and impossible strength created a framework for survival, knowledge encoded in narrative, warning all who might underestimate the land's dangers. Now, picture yourself in Portlock, mist curling around jagged cliffs, dense timber pressing close, the ground soft underfoot. Every tree hums with an invisible pressure. Your head aches, stomach churns, every shadow stretches and twists into menace. The fog distorts sound, amplifying every whisper, every distant cry into a cacophony of potential threats. Do you wait, trying to confront what you cannot see? Or do you flee, like all who came before, fleeing an enemy that is half known and half imagined? In Portlock, fear is as tangible as the wind, as relentless as the tide. The initial strike might be unseen, psychological, an invisible force bending your mind. But behind that comes the corporeal threat. Mass, strength, intent. Some predator waits harnessing the land, the hum, the dread, to isolate and weaken. Isolation magnifies the terror. Alone in the mist, it's impossible to distinguish wind from whisper, shadow from threat. The human mind, fragile in the face of the unknown, begins to see patterns where none exist, or worse, to recognize patterns that do. In Portlock, the forest itself seems alive, observing, judging, and waiting. Portlock remains a place people avoid, a ghost on the map, a settlement that was never truly settled. What occurred here, whether predator, natural force, or something beyond comprehension, is undeniable. Men vanished, animals were destroyed, sleds flung, bodies crushed. Fog rolls in, carrying echoes of cries from centuries past. Some claim the hum still lingers in the trees, a silent warning or a predator's instrument. Others insist the land remembers, retaining its ability to repel, to drive humans from its shores. For skeptics, the answer lies in geology, infrasound, and psychological phenomena. For believers, the woods hold a creature, a force, a Nantinak that has claimed its territory and weaponized fear itself. Portlock endures as a living mystery, a place where history and legend intertwine. It challenges human understanding, mocks our assumptions of safety, and reminds all who hear its story that some places were never meant to be tamed. Tonight, as you listen to these words, imagine the mist creeping over the cliffs, the invisible hum pressing against your mind, and the knowledge that somewhere within the dense Alaskan forest, the legacy of Portlock waits, silent, patient, and ever watchful. Even after centuries, the darkness around Portlock seemed alive. The settlers who stayed in the 1800s spoke of nights so silent that even the wind seemed absent, yet every shadow felt like a predator. Hunters would leave camp to check traps or gather firewood and never return. Fishermen vanishing from the riverbank, sleds overturned, dogs gone without trace. These were not rare tales, but repeated events, documented and whispered alike. Eyewitnesses described huge figures moving just beyond the fog, half seen yet impossibly powerful. One settler recalled hearing the crash of trees bending as if something immense had rammed through the forest. Another found a trap line destroyed, footprints larger than any man's but too elongated, clawed, to belong to known wildlife. Sometimes cries would pierce the night, guttural, human-like, yet distorted, echoing in the valleys so that they seemed to come from all directions. The psychological toll was immense. Families barricaded themselves indoors, fire kept burning through the night, and every small sound, a branch snapping, a distant splash, triggered panic. Children awoke screaming from nightmares, convinced that something was watching. Adults, otherwise rational, admitted that the fear had a weight that pressed on their shoulders and their minds alike. Some swore that the forest itself was aware of them, that the mist carried eyes, and that every rustle was a warning. Leave, or be taken, whether it was the Nantinak, an apex predator, or simply the cruel interplay of isolation and environmental stress. One thing was clear: Portlock punished intrusion. Nighttime became synonymous with threat, and those who had once considered settlement saw no choice but flight. It was a place where disappearance was ordinary, where the dark had teeth, and where silence itself was predatory. By the mid-20th century, people still attempted to settle Portlock, drawn by its untapped resources: salmon-rich rivers, dense timber, and fertile soil. But even then, the pattern repeated itself. Families who arrived during summer reported days filled with strange occurrences. Dogs barked at unseen presences. Traps were found destroyed overnight. Fires extinguished mysteriously, only to reignite with no apparent cause. On one fateful night in 1950, the final exodus took place. Accounts tell of families abandoning homes, wagons left in haste, belongings scattered across the forest floor. One settler recalled waking to a low-frequency hum vibrating through the ground. The children cried out in fear, sensing what the adults could not define. By dawn, entire households had fled, leaving Portlock deserted once again. Investigators at the time found overturned sleds, broken fences, and clawed marks on wooden structures. Animals had been mauled or carried away, leaving no trace. The locals whispered that even the birds had fled, that the coast itself was haunted by something immense. For those who remained, the land was not simply hostile. It was a predator, patient and intelligent, able to drive humans away without direct confrontation. What makes the 1950 exodus particularly compelling is the continuity it demonstrates. The Spanish, the British, Sugpiaq, and Alutiiq settlements had all experienced disruption, sickness, fear, disappearances, but by the 20th century, humans had modern tools and technology, yet they still could not endure Portlock. The land had become a living warning, an immutable law of avoidance. Those who dared to study it later would realize that whatever haunted Portlock was both subtle and brutal, shaping human behavior without ever being fully seen. Modern researchers have approached Portlock with both skepticism and intrigue. Geological studies revealed the jagged cliffs and dense, echoing valleys create ideal conditions for low-frequency vibrations. Known as infrasound, these waves, imperceptible to the human ear, can still affect the body: nausea, disorientation, panic, headaches. In controlled experiments, infrasound has been shown to amplify anxiety, making ordinary noises seem threatening. Some scientists propose that Portlock's unique topography, valleys funneling wind, cliffs resonating with surf, occasional seismic tremors, produces natural infrasound capable of unnerving anyone unprepared. Coupled with isolation, limited visibility, and a constant sense of surveillance, the physiological impact on settlers becomes more understandable. Yet even scientific explanations fall short. The physical aftermath, overturned sleds, destroyed cabins, and mutilated animals, cannot be explained by waves alone. Researchers concede that Portlock presents a rare combination: environmental phenomena intensifying fear, coupled with actual threats, perhaps predators, that exploit this fear. For modern observers, the mystery of Portlock is both tantalizing and troubling. Nature alone may explain part of the terror, but it does not account for deliberate physical predation. The line between science and legend blurs here, leaving Portlock suspended in a liminal space, a place that tests human understanding and endurance simultaneously. The Sugpiaq oral histories provide a perspective older than any European record. They speak of the Nantinak, a half-man, half-beast predator whose presence justified curfews, restricted travel at night, and guided settlement patterns. The Nantinak were not mere monsters. They were forces of survival, deeply entwined with human experience. Villagers recalled nights when the Nantinak would stalk the edges of settlements, leaving claw marks, snapping trees, and occasionally carrying away livestock or people. These creatures were said to be colossal, sometimes taller than 3 men standing together, hairy, and endowed with immense strength. More than predators, they were cautionary tales given form, a living memory encoded in stories, rituals, and warnings. Even as outsiders dismissed these tales, the warnings had tangible impact. Families heeded curfews, avoided certain valleys, and learned to read subtle signs of danger, broken branches, odd footprints, or strange sounds echoing through the fog. The legacy of Nantinak illustrates how human survival adapted around what outsiders might label myth. The creature, whether real or symbolic, shaped behavior and preserved life by instilling caution where recklessness might otherwise prevail. Today, Portlock is silent, overgrown, and largely abandoned. Nature has reclaimed the land, forests growing thick around the skeletal remains of cabins and docks. Few venture here, but those who do report an uneasy feeling, a low hum, shadows in the mist, and a sense of being watched. Hikers, researchers, and occasional adventurers speak of sudden nausea, vertigo, and disorientation in the forest. Some claim glimpses of massive figures disappearing into the fog. The physical geography remains: steep cliffs, jagged rocks, echoing valleys. Waves crash into hidden coves, the surf amplifying sounds in strange and unnatural ways. The wind whistles through hollow trees and deep ravines, creating distortions of sound that are almost sentient. Portlock, even in its present form, continues to resist human encroachment, preserving its reputation as a place both beautiful and terrifying, a wilderness where history and legend are inseparable. The enduring question of Portlock is why human fear seems magnified here, crossing centuries and cultures. Psychologists suggest that isolation, limited visibility, and environmental stress trigger primal survival mechanisms, causing humans to perceive patterns, shapes, and movement that may not exist. Folklorists argue that legends like the Nantinak encode survival strategies, translating environmental awareness into narrative. Yet nothing fully explains the combination of psychological terror and tangible destruction. In Portlock, humans encounter a world where mind and body are assaulted simultaneously, invisible vibrations, shadows that may conceal predators, and physical evidence of attacks. The intersection of legend, science, and human perception creates a scenario in which fear itself becomes a tool, manipulated by both environment and predator. This interplay keeps Portlock in a state of liminality, a place where stories are true enough to be felt, yet impossible to verify fully. The forest, the fog, and the cliffs create a theater of fear, and the unknown, whatever it may be, exerts its influence quietly, relentlessly, and without mercy. Portlock endures as a place of mystery and caution. Centuries of encounters, Spanish sailors, British explorers, Sugpiaq settlers, 20th century families, paint a consistent pattern: hope, dread, and ultimately flight. Some leave with only their lives, others vanish entirely, leaving the land itself as witness. The invisible hum lingers, the fog curls, and the shadows in the forest remain restless. For skeptics, the phenomena are natural: infrasound, environmental stress, and isolation. For believers, a predator, or a force beyond comprehension, haunts the coast, wielding fear as a weapon. Regardless of explanation, Portlock is unforgettable, a place where humans cannot fully claim mastery over the land. It is a reminder that some territories remain untamed, their secrets preserved in the mist, the trees, and the echoes of history. For anyone who dares approach, the lesson is clear: tread lightly, respect the unknown, and remember the thousands of footsteps that fled before you, leaving only whispers in the Alaskan night. Decades after the final exodus, explorers and researchers returning to Portlock stumbled upon remnants of lives abruptly abandoned. Cabins stood half-decayed, roofs sagging under the weight of moss and snow, walls lined with rusted nails and the skeletal remains of furniture. Fishing gear lay scattered as if last used the day before, nets torn, hooks rusted, and baskets half-filled with salmon long rotted. Even half-prepared meals, left to the elements, hinted at families who fled in fear without warning. Archaeologists noted the hasty nature of these departures. Tools abandoned mid-task, fire pits still warm in the fading heat, and personal belongings left in disarray painted a picture of panic frozen in time. Clothing, tattered and faded, hung from nails, caught in brambles, while journals and ledgers, surprisingly intact under layers of dirt, told stories of daily life interspersed with growing anxiety. Native artifacts, arrowheads, woven baskets, and ceremonial items spoke of centuries of human presence before Europeans arrived. These objects carried a weight beyond the material. They were echoes of survival strategies, of knowledge passed down to avoid the dangers of the forest and coastline. Each discovery hinted at a dual reality, the mundane work of survival juxtaposed against a deep, pervasive threat that forced people to leave, leaving their tools and lives behind. To walk through Portlock's ruins was to feel the invisible hand that shaped human behavior. The silence was deafening, the forest reclaiming everything. Yet in the careful placement of broken objects, the toppled furniture, and the signs of hurried departure, one could sense the echoes of fear that had defined this land for centuries. Every artifact was a whisper of terror, a warning etched into the material world by those who once called Portlock home. Portlock's wilderness is alive with more than wind and fog. Animals here behave in ways that unsettle even seasoned hunters. Wolves are unusually aggressive, circling settlements in tight formations, their eyes glowing in the mist. Birds vanish from certain valleys, their songs silenced, leaving an eerie quiet that makes the forest feel unnatural. Tracks of unidentified creatures, too large, too clawed, and often disappearing without a trace, have been reported for generations. Settlers and researchers alike describe encounters with massive, shadowy forms moving through the fog. One 20th-century hiker recounted glimpsing a towering figure bending a tree effortlessly before vanishing without a sound. Fishermen reported strange disturbances in rivers, large, unidentifiable shapes displacing water and leaving unnatural ripples behind. This wildlife, real or imagined, adds to the fear that permeates Portlock. The ecosystem seems to conspire with isolation, fog, and the rugged geography to create a world where natural predators and unexplained phenomena blur together. Humans, already susceptible to the stress of survival in extreme conditions, are left unable to distinguish between ordinary wildlife and something far more threatening. The interactions between humans and wildlife in Portlock reveal a delicate balance. Animals may sense the invisible presence of predators, or they may be influenced by the same environmental factors, low-frequency vibrations, echoing valleys, that unsettle humans. Either way, encounters are rarely benign. The forest behaves like a sentient entity, reshaping itself around fear and threat, keeping its watchers on edge, and reinforcing the land's reputation as both alive and hostile. Portlock's mist is not merely atmospheric. It is a medium through which sound bends, distorts, and travels in ways that disorient the human mind. Early settlers described cries echoing across valleys, footsteps seemingly approaching from every direction, and rustling that felt impossibly close yet unseen. Every sound was amplified, elongated, or warped, creating the illusion of movement and presence where none existed. Modern acoustic studies suggest that valleys, cliffs, and dense forests can reflect and focus sound in unusual ways. Yet no scientific model fully accounts for the terror these echoes caused. To men and women isolated in the 18th and 19th centuries, the effect was unmistakably supernatural. The hum of low-frequency sound waves might have amplified fear, while echoes turned ordinary noises into a chorus of menace. Even today, hikers report similar phenomena. A twig snapping can sound like a tree crashing. Distant animal cries can resemble human screams. The fog carries every sound unpredictably, twisting reality and perception. Portlock teaches a lesson. The mind is inseparable from the environment. And when nature conspires with uncertainty, ordinary sounds can become instruments of dread. Physical evidence from Portlock continues to baffle researchers. Crushed bones found beneath toppled trees, sleds hurled across clearings, and deep claw marks on wooden structures all point to a force capable of tremendous strength and intent. These are not the random accidents of storms or bears. They are acts of deliberate power, leaving tangible proof of a predator that may be invisible. Settlers reported missing hunters, dogs found torn apart, and livestock carried away without trace. Items left behind, tools, food, clothing, showed signs of violent disruption, as if something had sought to destabilize the lives of those who remained. Archaeologists studying abandoned villages note the consistency of such evidence. Scattered possessions, clawed surfaces, and twisted implements suggest a repeated pattern rather than isolated incidents. Even modern visitors recount the same sense of unseen pressure. Forests seem to breathe, objects shift subtly, and disturbances appear overnight without explanation. Portlock's physical evidence challenges our assumptions about what is possible in nature. If a predator exists here, it is unlike any known animal, a force that combines intelligence, strength, and subtlety, leaving humanity perpetually uncertain of its presence until it is too late. The Nantainak of Sukpiak and Alutiiq lore is not merely a story to frighten children. It is a cultural memory of survival in a dangerous landscape. These tales describe a predator that is part human, part beast, roaming forests and coasts, hunting when resources are scarce, and targeting humans when opportunity arises. The Nantainak are described as giants, hairy and powerful, capable of bending trees and carrying away people with ease. Stories recount villages that vanished overnight, raids that left families scattered, and encounters where escape seemed impossible. Rituals, curfews, and sacred warnings encoded behavioral rules to avoid disaster. For settlers, these legends may have seemed fantastical, yet they represent a practical adaptation to the unique dangers of Portlock. The persistence of these tales across generations reinforces the connection between environment